Dawn struggled to break through the smoke over the frozen steppe. The air was brittle, sharp enough to cut through a wool scarf, and every breath carried the metallic taste of engine fumes and distant gunfire. On a makeshift airstrip carved into the white expanse, mechanics stood motionless for a heartbeat, heads tilted toward the horizon. A low rumble approached uneven, wounded. Out of the pale morning haze, an Il-2 emerged, skimming just feet above the ground, its landing gear half-frozen, its armored fuselage torn open by cannon fire. Oil streaked across the wing root. Fabric fluttered where metal should have been. The aircraft lurched, fought gravity, then slammed onto the runway in a shower of ice and dust. Ground crew sprinted toward it. They counted the bullet holes, tracing their fingers across the jagged edges. More than 100, they guessed. Maybe more. This one shouldn't have made it back. Inside the cockpit, the pilot didn't move at first. He sat breathing against the frost, hands trembling on the stick. He knew the name they gave his aircraft, the Flying Coffin. Every man here did. And yet, day after day, they climbed into it because something even more dangerous waited on the ground. And this flight, like so many, marked only the beginning of what the war would demand next when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. The Soviet Union faced a catastrophe without precedent. 3 million Axis soldiers surged across a front stretching thousands of kilometers, supported by nearly 3,000 aircraft. Entire Soviet armies collapsed under the pace of the German advance. Airfields burned. Command posts vanished in the smoke. Within days, hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed, many still lined up wingtip to wingtip, never having left the ground. For the Red Air Force, the opening weeks were nothing short of catastrophic. Pilots flew obsolete machines. Mechanics lacked spare parts. Fuel depots were overrun. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies so completely that Soviet ground troops often fought their battles under a constant storm of Stuka sirens and strafing runs. Every column, every supply line, every retreating formation was exposed. Amid this chaos, one idea remained firmly planted in the mind of Soviet leadership. The frontline troops needed a dedicated ground attack aircraft. Something armored. Something survivable. Something capable of smashing German columns and giving the infantry a fighting chance. This idea had been nurtured before the war by aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin, a man convinced that a heavily armored assault plane could serve as the spearhead of modern warfare. His prototype, the Il-2, had entered limited production less than a year earlier. At its heart was a concept radically different from Western attack planes. Instead of adding plates around a standard airframe, the Il-2 was armor. A welded steel shell formed the core of the aircraft, protecting the pilot, engine, fuel, and vital systems. It was a flying fortress in miniature. But when the German invasion came, only small numbers of Il-2s were available, and their crews were painfully inexperienced. Pilots received minimal training, sometimes only a handful of flight hours on the type, before being ordered to combat. They learned the aircraft's quirks, strengths, and deadly weaknesses only after crossing the front line for the first time. Those early missions were brutal. Il-2 units were thrown directly into the teeth of the Wehrmacht's advance, tasked with destroying tanks, trucks, artillery, anything slowing the German momentum. They flew at treetop height, diving into smoke and dust, their cannons hammering, their RS-82 rockets streaking toward targets. But for each successful strike, the cost was devastating. German fighters Bf-109s and later FW-190s learned quickly how to exploit the aircraft's sluggish climb rate and heavy frame. The result was chaos in the skies. Entire Soviet squadrons vanished during a single sortie. Loss rates reached staggering levels. At times, barely half the pilots returned. Survivors landed with missing control surfaces, shredded wings, or fires smoldering inside the armored shell. Yet the front demanded more. And Stalin himself, upon learning that production had slowed due to factory complications, responded with a now famous telegram accusing aircraft builders of withholding a weapon the Red Army desperately needed. The Il-2 is as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. His meaning was unmistakable. Production must increase, no matter the cost. But high production alone could not solve the deeper problem. The Il-2, despite its powerful armor and weapons, suffered a dangerous flaw: it had no rear gunner. The single-seat design left the aircraft exposed from behind, a vulnerability German pilots exploited mercilessly. Approaching from the 6 o'clock position, a skilled Luftwaffe fighter could fire into the engine and cockpit with near impunity. Pilots knew this. They flew anyway. Back on the ground, Soviet infantry began noticing a pattern. Whenever they felt abandoned, whenever the front seemed on the brink of collapse, the distant growl of Il-2 engines signaled hope. The aircraft might not always return, but its attacks tore gaps through German columns and forced supply lines to scatter. Troops spoke of the Black Death, a name the Germans themselves would later use to describe the Il-2's arrival. And so, while the Soviet Union reeled under the weight of the German onslaught, one truth became clear: the Il-2 was needed, flawed or not. It became the workhorse of the front, flown by men who knew they were climbing into a machine many already called a flying coffin. Losses rose. Factories raced to keep up. And at every airfield from Leningrad to the Don Basin, the question was not whether the Il-2 could survive the war, but whether the Soviet Union could survive without it. That desperate need formed the backdrop to the aircraft's troubled evolution, a transformation that would unfold far from the front lines. Deep within the industrial heart of a nation fighting for its existence far behind the front line, another battle raged, one fought not with rifles and artillery, but with cranes, furnaces, and assembly lines. When the German advance threatened the heart of Soviet industry in 1941, entire factories were ordered to evacuate. Machinery was dismantled bolt by bolt. Workers loaded equipment onto rail cars already strained with refugees and military units. Families were uprooted overnight. Production halls in Moscow, Voronezh, and other western cities fell silent as thousands of tons of industrial equipment crept eastward toward the Urals and Siberia. Among the plants evacuated were those responsible for building the Il-2. The relocation was chaotic. Winter storms cut across the rail lines. Some equipment froze before it could be installed. Workers slept beside machine tools to keep them from being buried under snow. And yet, despite this upheaval, Ilyushin's design bureau insisted that Il-2 production not only resume, but expand. The Red Army needed hundreds of aircraft each month. Then thousands. The pressure was relentless. To meet the demand, factories hired anyone capable of lifting a tool. Teenagers, elderly laborers, and a vast workforce of women stepped into roles once filled by trained machinists. Entire production teams were made up of women who had never seen an aircraft before the war. They worked 12- and 16-hour shifts in unheated workshops, hands blistered from metal filings and frostbite, learning to assemble armored fuselage sections with precision under impossible conditions. The Il-2's design was both a challenge and a blessing in this environment. Its armored shell required heavy steel plates bent and welded with exact tolerances. Mistakes couldn't be hidden under cosmetic panels. The armor was the aircraft. Yet the simplicity of its overall shape made rapid mass production feasible once the lines were stabilized. By mid-1942, output began to surge. But as more Il-2s reached the front, a grim truth became undeniable. Pilots were dying faster than factories could build machines. Training programs were brutally compressed. New pilots learned takeoffs, landings, and basic maneuvers before being rushed to active units. Some had never fired the aircraft's cannons before their first combat sortie. Others had flown only biplanes, now suddenly expected to master a 4-ton armored monoplane with the handling of a hammerhead shark. Instructors warned, "Do not climb. Do not break away. Stay low. Stay fast." But low flight meant flying through trees, telephone wires, and ground fire. Fast meant overtaxing the engine, and the lack of a rear gunner remained the defining weakness. German fighters quickly developed textbook tactics. A pair of 109s would distract a group of Il-2s from above, while a third dove straight into their blind spot. One burst. One fireball. Another Sturmovik lost. Frontline commanders reported that entire squadrons could be wiped out in weeks. Pilots called the aircraft Ilyusha with affection, but another nickname grew louder across airfields: the flying coffin. Not because the armor failed, but because once a German fighter latched onto an Il-2's tail, the pilot had no way to defend himself. He could only hope the armor would hold long enough to reach friendly lines. Often, it didn't. Ilyushin's engineers argued for a rear gunner from the beginning, but early production constraints made it impossible. The Soviet Union simply didn't have the time, materials, or training pipeline for a two-seat variant in the opening year. But as pilot losses mounted, the pressure became overwhelming. By late 1942, a redesigned Il-2 rolled off the line now with a rear gunner's cockpit carved into the armor shell. The addition transformed the aircraft's silhouette and survivability. A flexible UBT 12.7mm machine gun gave German fighters a reason to hesitate. Pilots reported feeling, for the first time, pressure lifted from the back of their necks, that constant fear of unseen bullets about to tear through the cockpit. The Il-2 had not become invincible, but it had become complete. Still, its trials were far from over. To influence the war's direction, the aircraft would need more than armor and guns. It would require new tactics, coordinated units, and a shift in Soviet air doctrine changes that would emerge gradually as the Red Army steadied itself and the Luftwaffe faced growing strain. And as these adjustments took shape, a multifaceted story unfolded, one that can be understood only by examining the Il-2 from several angles: human, technological, tactical, and psychological. Each reveals a different layer of how a machine once feared by its own pilots became one of the war's defining weapons. For the men who flew it, the Il-2 was less an aircraft and more a trial by fire. Pilots climbed into the armored cockpit, knowing every mission carried a real chance of being their last. The cockpit was cramped, sealed by armor plates that echoed every vibration of the engine. Vision was limited through narrow armored glass panels that froze instantly in winter. The smell of oil never left their gloves. And beneath the cockpit floor, a thin metal plate separated their boots from the roar of the AM-38 engine, the lifeline that could fail without warning. Flying low was not a tactical preference, it was survival. Pilots hugged the ground to avoid German fighters, weaving around tree lines, skimming over frozen rivers, and bursting through clouds of smoke rising from burning villages. They attacked at ranges so close that debris from exploding vehicles sometimes struck their own wings. After each sortie, mechanics inspected aircraft with paint scorched off, shrapnel embedded in armor, and glass cracked by near misses. Every mission required composure under sensory overload, cannon recoil shaking the cockpit, anti-aircraft bursts filling the sky with black scars, and the constant fear of a fighter dropping in unseen from behind. For many pilots, the war became a cycle of adrenaline and dread, the aircraft both protector and threat. Yet, as casualties mounted, their determination hardened. The Il-2 demanded everything from them, and they gave it, believing that their assault runs helped hold the front together, one burning column at a time. This human strain became the pulse of the aircraft's early war history, a strain echoed in the machine's very design. The Il-2 was unlike anything produced by any other nation during the war. Its armored shell, weighing up to 700 kilograms, formed the structural skeleton of the aircraft. This armor bathtub, as engineers called it, protected vital components from small arms fire and light cannon shells. German ground troops often complained that the aircraft simply refused to go down. Their rifle fire pinged off the fuselage like gravel on steel. Armament was formidable on paper. two 23mm Via cannons, two 7.62mm machine guns, and racks for high-explosive rockets or fragmentation bomblets. In practice, early cannons jammed under sustained fire, rockets were notoriously inaccurate, and bombs required precise low-altitude drops that placed pilots dangerously close to enemy fire. But when everything worked, the aircraft could dismantle supply convoys, shred infantry positions, and break lightly armored vehicles apart with a single pass. Yet the same armor that made the Il-2 fearsome also made it heavy and unresponsive. Pilots fought the stick during every maneuver, especially in climbing or trying to evade fighters. The aircraft's weight robbed it of speed at altitude, turning it into an easy target for German interceptors. And before the addition of the rear gunner, there simply was no answer once a fighter got into position. Still, the Il-2's design embodied a philosophy: survive long enough to deliver a crippling blow. Its technological compromises reflected the desperate conditions under which it was built, a machine tailored for a battlefield ruled by tanks, trenches, and relentless attrition. As German forces adapted, so too did those who fought against the Il-2. To German troops on the ground, the first sign of an Il-2 attack was often the shadow sweeping across the snow. Then came the whine of engines and the thunder of cannons. Soldiers dived for cover as fragmentation bomblets rained down like metallic hail. Panzer crews learned to button up their hatches quickly, knowing that a delayed response could be fatal if a rocket struck a fuel drum or an exposed track. For Luftwaffe fighter pilots, however, the Il-2 was both a threat and an opportunity. Its armor made frontal attacks risky, but its slow climb rate and limited rear visibility made it vulnerable from behind. Fighters like the Bf-109F and later the FW-190A could outmaneuver it effortlessly. Many German pilots treated Il-2s as relatively easy kills, at least in 1941 and 1942, provided they avoided the armored engine block. Pilots were taught to aim for the radiator, the wings, or the unarmored rear fuselage. One burst of cannon fire into the cooling system was often enough to bring the aircraft down. Yet the Il-2 earned their respect. Even damaged, it could remain airborne long enough to retreat behind Soviet lines. Its armor absorbed punishment that would have shredded other aircraft. And once the two-seat version arrived with a rear machine gun, attacks from behind became far more hazardous. Several Luftwaffe pilots described Il-2 formations as flying tanks, difficult to kill quickly and increasingly dangerous when escorted by Soviet fighters. In the enemy's eyes, the Il-2 evolved from prey to a resilient adversary, a shift that mirrored its growing presence across the front. That evolution set the stage for deeper changes in Soviet industry, leadership, and battlefield doctrine. Behind the Il-2 stood a network of decisions made not only by engineers, but by the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The aircraft's existence was shaped by necessity, pressure, and an unwavering belief that industrial output could compensate for catastrophic battlefield losses. Stalin's telegram chastising factory directors became a symbol of this urgency, but the real story lay in the factories scattered across the East. Supervisors pushed workers beyond endurance. Assembly lines ran day and night under dim, flickering lamps. Managers balanced impossible quotas with shortages of aluminum, fuel, rubber, and skilled labor. Mythology often portrays Soviet industry as unstoppable, but the reality was far more fragile. Machinery froze in sub-zero temperatures, welders collapsed from exhaustion, and parts arrived late or sometimes not at all. Yet the leadership understood one truth: each Il-2 that rolled off the line could directly influence the front. Reports from the battlefield showed that even small numbers of these aircraft could delay German advances. That connection, a direct line from factory floor to frontline survival, motivated thousands of workers who would never see combat themselves. The two-seat redesign, approved after a long struggle between engineers and production authorities, embodied a rare moment where leadership adapted under pressure rather than imposing a rigid doctrine. It showed that even in a system known for inflexibility, the weight of battlefield experience could force change. Through this industrial crucible, the Il-2 became more than a machine. It became a symbol of national will forged under duress, shaped by necessity, and sustained by millions of hands, far from the roar of engines and gunfire. Early in the war, IL-2 units attacked in small groups, sometimes even alone, diving into battle with bravery but little coordination. These attacks were courageous, but often ineffective. German flak guns concentrated fire on the first aircraft to appear, while fighters circled overhead waiting for stragglers. Losses mounted with predictable regularity. But by mid-1942 and throughout 1943, Soviet doctrine shifted. Combat reports showed that the IL-2's strength lay in mass and synchronized action. Rather than small flights of 3 or 4, entire regiments began launching coordinated strikes. Dozens of aircraft flew in tight wedges, saturating a target area with rockets, bombs, and cannon fire in a single overwhelming wave. Navigation improved. Communication between ground units and assault aircraft became more reliable. Forward air controllers emerged, guiding IL-2s toward German tank spearheads and supply routes with growing precision. The aircraft's role expanded from desperate counterattacks to deliberate support within combined arms offensives. These tactical refinements transformed the IL-2 into a weapon that could genuinely shape battles rather than merely harass enemy positions. Its effectiveness grew not through technological advances alone, but through disciplined organization and hard-learned battlefield experience. What began as a blunt instrument evolved into a guided hammer, one capable of striking where the front needed it most. These changes paved the way for the aircraft's decisive role when the German summer offensive of 1943 approached. For Soviet crews, flying the IL-2 became an emotional burden as heavy as the steel armor surrounding them. Every airfield housed memorial boards listing names of pilots who had not returned, often updated daily. New crews arrived with a quiet, resigned determination, aware that their life expectancy could be measured in weeks during certain periods of the war. Yet despite the grim statistics, morale remained surprisingly resilient. Pilots believed their aircraft mattered. They saw infantry cheering from trenches as IL-2s roared overhead. They heard reports of convoys scattered, bridges destroyed, tank formations halted. Even when the aircraft was mocked as a flying coffin, it was a coffin that could break enemy lines. This psychological connection extended to the enemy. German soldiers learned to fear the distinctive outline of the Sturmovik. Some referred to it as the Black Death, not because it was invincible, but because its attacks often preceded Soviet counteroffensives. Its presence implied momentum, the sense that the Red Army was not breaking, but rising. Inside the cockpit, pilots carried photographs, lucky charms, and brief notes from home. Most kept them tucked into flight suits where armor offered the least protection, a small attempt to shield something personal against the machinery of war. The weight of fear and duty blended into a quiet resolve. If the front demanded another sortie, they would rise again. These human and strategic currents converged in 1943, when the IL-2 would face its greatest test and ultimately shift the course of the war. By early summer 1943, the Eastern Front braced for an impact both sides knew was coming. After the catastrophic winter of 1942-43 and the defeat at Stalingrad, German High Command sought a decisive operation to regain the initiative. That Operation Citadel centered on a massive salient around the city of Kursk, a bulge in the Soviet lines that offered the promise of encirclement and a return to offensive dominance. Inside this vast pocket of fields, villages, and rolling ridges, the Red Army built defensive works on a scale Europe had never seen. Thousands of mines, hundreds of kilometers of trenches, layers of anti-tank guns, artillery belts, and concealed firing positions. Yet even this formidable system would not hold without air support. The Wehrmacht intended to punch through with armored spearheads, supported by elite panzer units and the Luftwaffe's remaining experienced pilots. For the Soviet Union, protecting those defensive lines from above would fall heavily on the Il-2. By 1943, Il-2 production had surged. Entire regiments possessed new two-seat variants. Rear gunners were now trained, armed, and ready. Soviet command, recognizing the aircraft's strengths and hard-fought lessons from 2 years of war, reorganized its employment. Instead of sporadic low-level attacks, Il-2 Guards regiments assembled in mass formations, coordinated with ground controllers and escorted by fighters. These formations became floating hammers, poised to fall wherever German armor advanced. When the German offensive began at dawn on July 5, 1943, the sky over Kursk erupted with smoke trails and engine roars. At first light, waves of German aircraft surged forward, Ju-87 Stukas, HS-129 ground attack planes, and formations of Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters. The opening hours were chaotic, a storm of contrails and tracer fire. But Soviet airfields were ready. Within minutes, Il-2 squadrons began lifting off from rough dirt strips, their wings loaded with RS-82 rockets and high-explosive bombs. On the northern sector near Orel, the first major Il-2 assault struck German armoured columns, advancing through minefields and prepared kill zones. Flying in tight groups, Sturmovix descended almost vertically over the fields, unleashing salvos that tore open supply trucks and artillery tractors. Shrapnel carved through infantry, attempting to clear lanes for advancing panzers. Reports from German units detailed entire battalions forced to slow as Soviet aircraft saturated advance routes with fragmentation bomblets. On the southern sector near Prokhorovka, Panzer Grenadier units advancing through wheat fields encountered their own aerial threat. As German tanks attempted to break through Soviet defensive belts, Il-2 formations swept in with coordinated accuracy not seen earlier in the war. Pilots attacked in rotating waves, one group diving in, another circling low, a third preparing its run, giving German flak crews almost no time to respond. Vehicles burned across the horizon. Fuel trucks erupted into towering pillars of smoke. Even heavily armoured Tiger tanks were forced to halt until air cover could drive the attackers away. The decisive change, however, lay in survivability. German fighters still pounced on Il-2 formations, but the presence of rear gunners and tighter Soviet escort coordination dramatically shifted the dynamic. Instead of helpless victims, Il-2s became dangerous targets. Rear gunners poured bursts of 12.7mm fire into pursuing fighters, sometimes driving them off, sometimes destroying them outright. Soviet Yak and Lassery's fighters swept down to protect the slower assault planes, turning the low-altitude airspace into a tangled battleground where the Luftwaffe could no longer dominate with impunity. Soviet ground commanders quickly realized the value of this new aerial coordination. They requested Il-2 strikes by radio, marking German breakthroughs with smoke, flares, or prearranged signals. As German armor pushed deeper into Soviet lines, Il-2s responded within minutes, smashing forward repair depots, disrupting ammunition dumps, and shredding infantry attempting to consolidate gains. Even German operational records began reflecting the shift. Panzer divisions reported delays caused not by Soviet tanks alone, but by relentless air attacks that struck at their flanks, rear elements, and supply arteries. What had once been an attritional nuisance became a serious operational obstacle. For the first time in the war, the Il-2 was not merely surviving, it was shaping the tempo of battle. Yet the decisive moment had not yet arrived. As the days passed and both sides committed reserves, one clash in particular would reveal just how far the Il-2 had come, a confrontation that would be remembered as one of the largest armoured engagements in history. The next phase of the battle would push the aircraft to its limits, demanding precision, endurance, and sacrifice as the German armoured thrust neared its most critical breakthrough point. They called it Ilyushin's Hunchback, before they called it a legend. In the late 1930s, while Europe drifted toward disaster, Soviet engineers wrestled with a question that no nation had fully solved. How do you build an aircraft that can survive flying directly into enemy fire? Fighters were fast, bombers were heavy, but nothing existed that could dive into the teeth of German armor, absorb punishment, and claw its way back to friendly lines. Sergei Ilyushin believed he could change that. His design team carved out a radical concept, an airplane built around armor rather than protected by it. The idea was almost absurd. A steel bathtub weighing nearly a ton, enveloping the engine, cockpit, and fuel tanks like a shell. Most aircraft added armor plates, last the Il-2 began with them. Wings, controls, and skin were simply attached to the armored core. Test pilots were stunned. The prototype handled like a stubborn mule on the ground and a sledgehammer in the air. But it could fly through small arms fire that shredded lesser planes, shrugging off hits with a sound like hail against a tin roof. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Il-2 was rushed from drawing board to battlefield in a matter of months. Factories ran day and night. Workers slept between machines. The aircraft began to roll out in such numbers that Stalin himself gave it a grim endorsement. The Red Army needs the Il-2 as much as it needs bread and water. Its pilots would need far more than that. The Il-2's baptism of fire came not with ceremony, but with desperation. In the summer of 1941, German armored spearheads sliced through the western USSR with terrifying speed. Columns of panzers rolled across open fields almost unopposed, their treads kicking up dust that lingered in the air like smoke from a distant wildfire. Soviet commanders threw everything they had toward the front trucks, cavalry, untested recruits, but nothing slowed the advance. Then, at last, the first Il-2 squadrons arrived. Pilots who had barely logged enough flight hours to master takeoff were pushed into the cockpit and ordered to strike German armor immediately. Many had never fired their cannons outside of training. Some learned radio procedures on the way to their very first mission. Their target: a German tank column near Orsha. The Il-2s came in low, barely 30 meters above the wheat, engines howling. German gunners opened fire, instantly streams of tracers rising to meet them like furious sparks from a forge. Pilots felt the impacts through the pedals and seat, the blunt thuds of bullets punching the armored hull. But the aircraft held. As they closed the distance, the Il-2s unleashed their own answer. 23mm cannon fire, rockets and fragmentation bombs that erupted beneath the tank formation. For the first time, German units watched their advance stagger, their vehicles burning beneath the assault of a weapon they had never encountered. When the Soviet aircraft returned to base, ground crews stared in disbelief. Many machines were so scarred they resembled flying scrap metal, yet they had survived. It was the moment the Germans first muttered a new name with unease: Schwarzer Tod. The Black Death German frontline accounts reveal an emotion rarely admitted in official reports: fear. The source of that fear was not the Il-2's speed, elegance, or maneuverability. It had none of those. What shook German units was its purpose. The Il-2 was designed from the ground up to kill anything that moved on the battlefield. Its armored shell, a literal steel bathtub, gave pilots protection unheard of in most frontline aircraft. Machine gun rounds that shredded lighter planes simply sparked or flattened themselves uselessly against the Il-2's skin. Even 20mm fire often passed through without hitting anything vital, leaving the aircraft grotesquely wounded but still returning for another run. But what truly changed the psychology of German ground troops was the Il-2's attack profile. It came in low, very low. Instead of the steep diving runs of Stukas or the distant bombing patterns of high-altitude aircraft, the Il-2 approached like a predator stalking the ground. Soldiers reportedly heard the roar of its engine before they ever saw it. A split second later, the machine burst from behind the tree line, skimming the earth, cannons blazing. Its 23mm or later 37mm guns could punch through the thinner armor of early Panzer III and the 4th variants. Its RS-82 and RS-132 rockets shattered truck columns, artillery batteries, and fuel convoys. Even when accuracy was imperfect, and often it was the psychological effect was devastating. Units scattered. Columns halted. Coordination broke. Worse still, German troops realized something chilling. Killing one Il-2 rarely mattered. Because more always followed. And that growing wave of armored ground attack aircraft would soon develop into a weapon system capable of turning entire offensives for all its strengths. The Il-2 extracted a brutal price from the men who flew it. The aircraft's reputation for survivability often hid a harsher truth. Its pilot was not nearly as protected as the machine itself. The armored shell covered the engine and vital components well, but early single-seat versions left the pilot frighteningly exposed from above and behind. Enemy fighters quickly learned to exploit that blind spot. And in 1941–1942, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies. Il-2 pilots flew low by design, sometimes so low their wheels clipped treetops, leaving them little room to maneuver or escape. German Bf-109s and FW-190s dove down from altitude like hawks targeting prey, striking in seconds and disappearing just as fast. Many Il-2s were hit before the pilot even realized he'd been attacked. Inside the cockpit, the experience was harrowing. Metal splinters ricocheted from impacts. Plexiglass shattered. Hydraulic lines burst. Pilots described their cabins filling with the smell of fuel, cordite, and burned oil. Control sticks vibrated violently as cannon shells slammed into the wings. And yet the mission had to continue. Because the Il-2's battlefield role demanded precision at point-blank range, pilots were forced to hold their attack until the last possible second. Pulling up too early meant missing the target, and missing could cost entire Soviet ground units their lives. Thus, the aircraft became known among its own crews as a paradox: unbreakable to the enemy, unforgiving to its pilot. The nickname spread through airfields from Leningrad to Stalingrad. The flying coffin. And yet, despite everything, pilots kept climbing into it, a decision shaped by forces far greater than fear. Every Il-2 pilot knew the risks. They saw the empty bunks, the half-burned aircraft dragged back to the edge of the runway, the ground crews quietly removing dried blood from armored plates before the next sortie. And yet squadrons kept flying. Part of it was leadership. The leadership on the Eastern Front came in many forms. Soviet commanders demanded relentless air support to slow the German advance, and orders from above were absolute. Air regiments were expected to fly multiple missions per day in all weather, often with barely functional aircraft. Refusing a mission was unthinkable. But duty alone did not explain the determination. Most Il-2 pilots were young, barely 20, some even younger, drawn from aviation schools that had accelerated training to a dangerous pace. Many had lost their hometowns, their families, their childhood friends to the German invasion. For them, flying the Il-2 was not abstract patriotism, it was personal. Every destroyed tank, every shattered convoy felt like justice carved in steel. There was also a shared belief, a harsh but unifying one, that the Red Army on the ground depended on them. Infantry units watched Il-2s pass overhead like lifelines in the sky. Tank brigades cheered their approach. Soldiers wrote in diaries that the hunchback was the only comfort during the worst German assaults. To fail them felt worse than death. So pilots strapped themselves into narrow armored tubs, tightened their harnesses against the cold metal, and prepared to fly again. They carried the weight of their nation, the expectations of their commanders, and the memories of those they had already lost. And as the months wore on, a new, more dangerous phase began, one in which the Il-2 would evolve rapidly, becoming the backbone of Soviet close air support. By late 1942, the Soviet Union understood a difficult truth: bravery alone could not keep Il-2 pilots alive. The aircraft had power, armor, and firepower, but it needed protection. It needed refinement. It needed to become something more than a symbol of defiance. So engineers at factories in Kibyshev and Moscow began a relentless redesign effort. The most important change came first. The Il-2 became a two-seater again. A rear gunner armed with a 12.7mm machine gun transformed the aircraft's survivability. Luftwaffe pilots who once attacked with impunity now faced a stream of heavy defensive fire. Even when the gunner could not shoot down the attacker, he could force the German fighter to break off or ruin its firing angle. Losses dropped immediately. Then came structural adjustments. The wings were strengthened. Control surfaces refined. Weight distribution improved to reduce the Il-2's tendency to stall during steep maneuvers. New variants, like the Il-2M and later the Il-2 M3, incorporated swept outer wings for better low-altitude stability, crucial for the precision attacks that defined its role. Tactics evolved just as quickly. Instead of loose, vulnerable groups, Il-2s began flying in tight, coordinated formations with fighters above providing cover. They attacked in synchronized waves, first suppressing anti-aircraft positions, then striking tanks and artillery, and finally sweeping the battlefield for any vehicle attempting to escape. The Germans noticed the shift immediately. The once disorganized Soviet air raids had transformed into deliberate, crushing blows that mirrored the growing discipline of the Red Army itself. The Il-2 was no longer simply surviving the war. It was learning how to win it. That evolution set the stage for the aircraft's most dramatic transformation when it became the central weapon of massive Soviet operations. By 1943, the Il-2 was no longer a desperate stopgap thrown against the German advance. It had become something far more formidable, the primary striking arm of Soviet combined arms warfare. Every major Red Army offensive was now built with Il-2 squadrons woven into its blueprint. Soviet generals planned their attacks around three elements: artillery, armor, and the Il-2. In the opening minutes of an operation, while artillery thundered across the horizon, Il-2 formations swept low over German lines to smash anti-tank guns, silence machine gun nests, and scatter infantry concentrations. Their arrival signaled the beginning of ground movement. Tank brigades waited for the roar. Only when the hunchbacks passed overhead did they surge forward. The aircraft's firepower also evolved. The introduction of tab-shaped charge bomblets changed everything. These small anti-armor explosives, dropped in clusters, could penetrate the top armor of German tanks, an area usually far thinner than their frontal plates. For the first time, Il-2s could devastate an armored column in seconds, blanketing an entire area with dozens of armor-piercing strikes. German units felt the impact immediately. Reports described tanks destroyed as if by invisible blades falling from the sky. Commanders learned to disperse their formations the moment Il-2s appeared, sacrificing cohesion just to reduce casualties. What made the Il-2 so deadly in this period was its precision at treetop height. Pilots flew barely meters above the ground, dodging telephone wires and farmhouses as they lined up their targets. It required iron nerves, but it also meant German units had no time to react, no time to seek cover, no chance to reorganize. By mid-1943, the aircraft Stalin had once considered a questionable gamble had become the executioner of the Eastern Front, cutting supply lines, halting counterattacks, and opening corridors for Soviet breakthroughs. Its most defining test, however, was still ahead. A battle where the Il-2 would help turn the momentum of the entire war. The summer of 1943 brought the Eastern Front to a single heaving pause. For months, both armies dug in across a massive bulge in the lines, a 250-kilometer arc known as the Kursk salient. The Germans gathered their strongest remaining armored force, including the new Panther and the fearsome Tiger, preparing for an offensive designed to cut the Red Army in half. Operation Citadel, Hitler promised, would restore the initiative. The Soviets knew it was coming, and they prepared the sky for it. At dawn on the 5th of July 1943, the German assault began. The horizon lit up with artillery flashes as thousands of guns opened fire. Panzer divisions rolled forward in tight wedges, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Luftwaffe fighters swept ahead, seeking to clear the air for Stukas and armored ground attack aircraft. But they no longer faced the skies of 1941. Soviet aviation had changed, and at its heart stood the Il-2. Even before the German armor reached the first Soviet trench lines, Il-2 formations were already airborne. Their mission was brutally clear: break the spearhead before it could break the Red Army. The first wave, dozens of Il-2s from the 2nd Air Army, descended in disciplined echelons. They approached low, hugging the contours of the land, where German radar and spotters struggled to detect them. As the German formations pushed deeper, the Il-2s emerged from behind ridges and forest lines like a sudden coordinated storm. A German officer later wrote that the aircraft appeared so close to the earth they seemed to rise from the ground itself. The attack began with rockets. Long trails of smoke streaked toward the Panther and Tiger columns. The early impacts rarely destroyed the heavily armored tanks outright, but they did something just as important. They struck the support vehicles, the trucks, the half-tracks, the fuel carriers, the mobile flak units. The spearhead's arteries were severed before the main punch could fully land. Then came the TAB bomblets. Il-2 pilots opened their bomb bays at nearly point-blank range. Hundreds of shaped charges scattered like metallic rain, piercing the thin upper armor of German tanks. Panthers burned where they stood. Lighter vehicles erupted in plumes of black smoke. Even when tanks survived, their optics shattered, their turrets jammed, their crews stunned by concussion. Radio intercepts recorded panicked reports. Il-2s over the left flank, heavy casualties. Columns braking tanks hit from above. We need fighter cover immediately. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. Bf-109s dove into the melee, desperate to break the attack. But Soviet Yak and Laf-I fighters engaged them before they could reach the Il-2s. For the first time in the war, the Il-2s operated within an air umbrella that held. It didn't make them invincible, dozens were still lost, but it meant they could finish the job. Wave after wave struck the German formations. Il-2 gunner accounts describe seeing the battlefield blur into a collage of smoke pillars, burning fuel, and the flicker of exploding ammunition. Pilots could taste the acrid fumes even through their oxygen masks. Below them, the German southern thrust, the attack meant to deliver the decisive blow, began to stall. Panthers, too new for their crews to fully master, broke down or burned. Tigers found themselves isolated, their flanks exposed, their support vehicles already destroyed. Il-2 formations shifted tactics mid-battle. Once the tanks were halted, the aircraft switched to hunting infantry, artillery, and any mobile anti-aircraft guns still resisting. They strafed trenches, shattered gun pits, and silenced batteries that threatened Soviet positions. Red Army commanders reported that entire German regiments were forced to take cover for hours, unable to move under the constant threat of low-flying attack aircraft. For the troops on the ground on both sides, the Il-2's presence became overwhelming. Soviet soldiers watched the attacks with something close to reverence. Diaries describe infantrymen stopping in the trenches to cheer as the Black Death roared overhead. Tank crews later recalled that they felt shielded in moments when survival had seemed impossible. German troops experienced the opposite. Many remembered the terror of hearing the Il-2's cannons begin their run, a low guttural rumble that grew until it felt as though the earth itself was vibrating. Some units broke formation. Others abandoned disabled vehicles and fled for cover. Officers struggled to restore order while the sky filled with another approaching wave. The Il-2 had not won Kursk alone. But without it, the German armoured spearheads might have succeeded in their initial break-ins, and a breakthrough at Kursk would have reshaped the war. Instead, by the end of the first days of fighting, the German offensive had lost its momentum. The Red Army seized the initiative, and the Germans would never regain it. The Il-2's role was undeniable. It had helped blunt the strongest armoured attack the Wehrmacht ever mounted. And the battle was far from over. Because as July pressed on, the Il-2 was about to deliver its most punishing series of strikes, yet in decisive counteroffensives that followed. When the German offensive at Kursk faltered, the Soviet High Command did not hesitate. They launched the counterattack they had prepared for months: operations Kutuzov and Rumiantsev. Twin offensives designed to crush the exhausted German formations from both north and south. The Il-2 would play a defining role in both. On the 12th of July 1943, as Soviet tanks surged forward, Il-2 regiments were already airborne. sweeping ahead of the armoured wedges. Their orders were clear: obliterate German mobility. Anything that could move men, ammunition or fuel was to be destroyed before the Germans could regroup. The skies over Orel, Belgorod and the upper Donets basin became a constant thunder of lay-flying assault aircraft. German soldiers later recalled that the Il-2s appeared every hour, without pause, as if factories in the clouds were producing them. This time, Soviet air superiority held across multiple sectors. The Il-2s were free to attack with a level of persistence impossible in the early war. They used it mercilessly. For the first time in the conflict, large German formations attempted to retreat under sustained Il-2 assault, and the results were catastrophic. On the roads leading west of Orel, Il-2s found columns of trucks, half-tracks and horse-drawn wagons stretching for kilometers. German units had no choice but to retreat along predictable, congested routes, perfect targets for the Sturmovix. Il-2 groups struck in successive waves. The first wave destroyed anti-aircraft vehicles. The second hit fuel trucks and ammunition carriers. The third targeted the clogged traffic itself, infantry marching lines, command cars, supply vehicles, and any fleeing armor. The fourth wave returned to attack the burning wreckage, ensuring that nothing survived. German accounts describe entire marching columns disappearing under repeated low-altitude attacks. Vehicles burned so intensely that black smoke coated the roads for days. One German infantryman wrote that the Il-2s came down the road like executioners, row by row. Farther south, during the push toward Belgorod and Kharkov, the Il-2 demonstrated its full tactical maturity. Soviet tank armies advanced rapidly, often outrunning their artillery support. The only firepower capable of keeping pace was the Il-2. Air regiments were placed under direct coordination with frontline tank corps, responding to requests within minutes. It was a level of cooperation that the Red Army had lacked in the early war, now perfected through brutal necessity. A typical engagement unfolded like this. Soviet scouts spotted a German counterattack forming often remnants of panzer. Divisions attempting to blunt the advance. A radio call went out within 20 minutes. Il-2 formations descended over the battlefield. Tab bomblets blanketed the tank formations. Cannon fire shredded the infantry attempting to mount a defense. Soviet tanks surged forward as the German line collapsed. German officers noted that attempts to regroup were impossible. Every time units prepared to mount a coordinated defense, the Il-2s returned, scattering them once again. A veteran of the 3rd Panzer Division later said, wherever the Il-2s appeared, the front disintegrated. No signal, no command could hold men in place. As Soviet forces approached Kharkov for the fourth and final battle over the city, the Il-2's intensity reached its peak. Soviet air commanders concentrated entire air armies on choke points leading into the city. Bridges, rail yards, junctions, and river crossings were struck repeatedly. Any attempt to bring reinforcements into Kharkov came under immediate attack. German supply routes collapsed day by day, strangled by unrelenting air assault. Inside the city, retreating German troops found themselves trapped in a tightening ring of fire. Every breakout attempt was met with Il-2 strikes that tore open columns and forced them back into the ruins. When Kharkov fell in late August 1943, the breakthrough marked more than a territorial victory. It signaled the end of Germany's ability to conduct major summer offensives on the Eastern Front. And throughout the decisive weeks that made it possible, the Il-2 had flown thousands of sorties, more than any other aircraft in those operations. The flying Coffin had become something else entirely, a weapon that shaped the fate of armies. But victory came with a toll measured in blood, and steel, a toll that would haunt Soviet aviation for the rest of the war. When the smoke cleared over Kursk, Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkov, the Soviet Union stood on the verge of a strategic reversal that would carry it all the way to Berlin. But behind the triumph lay a story written in the wreckage of aircraft scattered across fields, forests, and the edges of forgotten villages. The Il-2 had been indispensable. It had also been consumed in staggering numbers. Throughout the war, the Soviet Union produced more than 36,000 Il-2Z, making it the single most manufactured military aircraft in history. Yet the scale of production hides the harsher truth. The losses were nearly as monumental. Aviation reports indicate that over 10,000 Il-2s were destroyed in combat. Many more were damaged beyond repair. Some regiments lost half their aircraft within days of intense fighting. Others were so decimated that surviving pilots were reassigned to entirely new units while their original regiment numbers simply ceased to exist. The human cost was even higher. Early in the war, survival rates for Il-2 pilots were among the lowest of any aircrew on the Eastern Front. Many lasted only a handful of months, sometimes weeks, before being shot down. The introduction of rear gunners improved the odds, but gunner casualties remained devastating. The Soviets struggled constantly to train enough replacements at times. New gunners were assigned to combat units with barely a few hours of familiarization. In many regiments, the pilot who flew a particular Il-2 might survive long enough to complete dozens, even hundreds, of sorties. But the gunners behind them changed again and again, a rotating list of names, faces and letters home that ended abruptly in smoke and flame. Yet despite the losses, morale inside Il-2 regiments remained surprisingly resilient. Several factors sustained it. First, pilots believed deeply in their mission. They saw the enemy they fought every day across the lines. Their work directly shielded Soviet infantry and tank crews from annihilation. Second, once fighter cover improved, pilots began to sense a shift, a feeling that their efforts were no longer simply delaying defeat but actively carving a path toward victory. Third, the aircraft itself inspired a contradictory loyalty. It was dangerous, unforgiving, and often poorly built in the early years, but it could also survive damage that would destroy any other plane. Pilots came to trust the Il-2's armor the way a tank crew trusted its turret. Still, the cost of keeping the aircraft in the air was enormous. Ground crews worked day and night, often cannibalizing multiple damaged Il-2s to restore one to flying condition. Factory workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored under brutal conditions to meet quotas. Entire production lines were relocated to the east, far from German bombers, yet workers endured freezing temperatures and shortages of metals and tools. By late 1943, the Il-2 was more than a weapon. It was a national effort, a machine sustained by the labor, sacrifice, and grief of millions. And in the months that followed, its role only expanded, carrying the Red Army through a sequence of relentless offensives that shattered German defensive lines from Ukraine to Poland. But as the front pushed westward, the nature of the air war began to change, revealing new challenges and new experiences for the crews who flew the legendary aircraft. After the twin victories around Kursk and Kharkov, the Red Army no longer fought with the desperation of survival. It advanced with momentum. And wherever the front shifted, the Il-2 shifted with it, a constant presence, its shadow cast across thousands of kilometers of war-torn land. From the autumn of 1943 to the final assault on Berlin, the Il-2 was present in every major Soviet offensive. Its missions multiplied, its roles expanded, and its reputation, feared by enemies, revered by allies, reached its peak. As Soviet forces pushed westward through Ukraine, the Il-2 became the blade that cut open fortified German positions. River crossings, rail hubs, and entrenched defensive belts all came under relentless air assault. In the battles of the Dnieper, Zhytomyr, Berdyshev, and Korsun, Il-2 struck German strongpoints so frequently that some Wehrmacht commanders described the skies as permanently hostile. In this period, the aircraft evolved from a tank destroyer into a general-purpose annihilator. Its missions included destroying artillery batteries, supporting German counterattacks, strafing infantry trapped in flooded riverbanks, hitting retreats over narrow bridges, breaking through air defenses with coordinated multi-regiment strikes. German diaries from the time capture the despair. The Il-2 arrives before we can prepare. It leaves only when nothing is left. By 1944, Soviet air superiority was decisive. Luftwaffe units, crippled by fuel shortages and attrition, could no longer contest Il-2 operations with the same intensity. Now the danger came primarily from anti-aircraft guns, and even these were overwhelmed when Il-2s attacked in large, synchronized groups. In the Baltic Offensive, Il-2 regiments targeted ports, convoys, and fortified coastal positions. When German formations attempted sea evacuations, Il-2s strafed the beaches and harbors, turning withdrawal points into killing grounds. In Poland, as the Red Army prepared for the Vistula-Oder offensive, entire clusters of Il-2s were assigned to support narrow breakthrough corridors. They cleared trenches, reduced bunkers, and shattered German command posts before the first Soviet tank moved. The assaults that followed tore across Poland so quickly that German units often had no time to prepare defensive lines. Survivors describe the Il-2's presence as inescapable, a weapon that erased the concept of a safe rear area. As Soviet forces crossed into East Prussia and the Reich's heartland, the Il-2 continued to adapt. Its pilots grew seasoned, its formations tighter, its attacks more deliberate. Missions often involved hunting isolated strongpoints, liquidating pockets of resistance, and destroying columns attempting to flee advancing Soviet armor. The East Prussian campaign saw some of the fiercest Il-2 operations of the entire war. German defensive positions were dense, entrenched, and supported by flak guns covering every approach. Losing aircraft was common, but the destruction inflicted was decisive. Il-2s cracked open fortresses, harassed withdrawing columns, and smashed counterattacks that attempted to buy time for refugees escaping westward. By the time Soviet forces encircled Berlin in April 1945, the Il-2 had flown more than 200,000 sorties in the conflict. It had supported nearly every major Red Army operation from the gates of Moscow to the streets of the German capital. And even in the war's closing days, the aircraft remained indispensable. Il-2s attacked pockets of resistance around the Spree and the Havel. They struck bridges, rail yards, and surviving armored vehicles trying to hold the last lines. In some sectors, Il-2 pilots even flew dangerously low to mark targets for advancing infantry, their final missions as the war drew to a close. By May 1945, the flying Coffin had become something else entirely. A symbol of Soviet endurance. A machine that helped break the Wehrmacht's spine. A weapon whose sacrifice shaped the outcome of the most brutal front of World War II. Its story did not end in Berlin, but its meaning crystallized there. And now, with the battles won and the front lines silent, the larger question emerged. What had all of this meant? When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Red Army's advance came to rest in the ruins of Berlin. The long arc of the war, from the desperate retreats of 1941 to the thunderous offensives of 1944-45, had come to its end. And threaded through every stage of that struggle was the unmistakable silhouette of the Il-2. For the men who flew it, the aircraft represented something contradictory yet deeply human. Fear and duty, vulnerability and strength, suffering and triumph. Pilots who had cursed the cramped cockpit, the brutal flak, and the constant mechanical strain would later speak of the Il-2 with a reverence that bordered on affection. It was imperfect. It was unforgiving. But it was theirs, and it helped them survive a war that offered few second chances. Historians often reduce the Il-2 to statistics. More than 36,000 built, the most produced combat aircraft in history, tens of thousands of sorties flown, thousands of tanks, vehicles, and guns destroyed. Yet these numbers obscure the reality that the Il-2's true legacy was cultural and psychological. It became, in the Soviet imagination, the voice of vengeance, the answer to the suffering of 1941, and the instrument that brought the fight back to German soil. The aircraft's design reflected the contradictions of the society that built it. It was rugged but crude, powerful but inflexible, devastating in attack but nearly defenseless when caught alone. Still, it embodied the Soviet approach to war. Emphasize what works, build it in unimaginable quantities, and change the course of battle through persistence and sacrifice rather than elegance or precision. To the soldiers on the ground, the arrival of the Il-2 became a symbol of hope. Infantry who had endured artillery barrages and tank assaults looked skyward whenever engines growled overhead. If the silhouettes were friendly, morale lifted instantly. If they were not, the effect was just as visceral. German ground troops came to dread the aircraft's shriek, a harsh, rattling sound produced by low-altitude dives and heavy ordnance. Many veterans from both sides later said the same thing. You never forgot the noise. And this, perhaps more than anything else, defines the Il-2's place in memory. Not the technical specifications, not the production numbers, not even the battlefield victories, but the emotional imprint. The Il-2 was felt before it was seen, feared before it was understood. In a war of immense scale, where individual soldiers were often swallowed by events beyond their control, the appearance of this aircraft could change morale, momentum, and the psychology of an entire sector. After the war, thousands of Il-2s were scrapped, melted down, or simply abandoned at airfields from Poland to Manchuria. The world moved quickly into the jet age, and the ungainly Stormovik became a relic of a conflict the Soviet Union wished both to commemorate and to forget. But for those who lived through the Eastern Front, its memory endured not as a museum piece, but as a symbol of survival. Today, only a handful remain airworthy. When one lifts off the ground in a modern airshow, its engine coughing to life, just as it did 80 years ago. Spectators often remark on how ordinary it looks. But for those who know its story, the sight is moving. That armored beast once called the Flying Coffin carried a nation through its darkest and most decisive hours. The Il-2 was not graceful. It was not refined. But it was essential. And in the end, that is its legacy.